So when we talk about the spread of English around the world, we use many-pronged discourse. So English coming to North America remains English except when it has been appropriated by descendants of Africans. And English in the Caribbean becomes Creoles because it has been appropriated in politics where non-Europeans have become majority populations. English in Australia remains English, although a large proportion of the white population there didn't even come from the British Isles. And English introduced to Africa and Asia has become new Englishes. And these are the kinds of things that we want to re-examine. I'm not saying that English has remained the same thing everywhere. The question is whether this is the best way to account for the speciation of English around the world, and whether we have realized that race has been an important factor, and this is the social notion of race, because we say language acquisition is independent of race. So we must have been operating on a social notion of race, and this social notion of race has underlain part of our scholarship in discussing the speciation of English as of other European languages. We have ignored the fact that most white Americans are not of English descent and are from continental Europe, and the adoption of English as a vernacular by them entails language contact and language shift at some point. We have ignored the differential language of the fact that differential language evolution is a common colonial experience. This is what happens with the spread of European languages, and there is a sense in which one can say Indo-European is still spreading around the world, and the diversification of Indo-European is continuing. And if we go and look at some precedents in history, for instance, in the linguistic consequences of Roman colonization, or the linguistic consequences of Indo-European colonization, and I'm using the term colonization deliberately here in the sense of colonization primarily in population genetics, when a population leaves, part of the population leaves their homeland and goes and resettles at another place. If the place is uninhabited, the equation is different. It's one way. If the place is already inhabited, then we have to look into the relations between the population of colonies and the indigenous population, what happens in that particular case. So in the case of Rome, there are a number of things that I don't want to get into, but we know that Latin was taken around the Mediterranean, and what matters the most here is Western Europe and Southwestern Europe in particular, and we know that that part of the world was not uninhabited, and the Romans colonized the Celts. And there are not many Celtic languages to speak of now, and a concomitant of that has been the emergence of the Romance languages. And the Romance languages are the showpiece of how the comparative method works in reconstructing the speciation of a language into offspring varieties. And despite similarities between this particular evolution and what we observe in the case of Creoles, English coming in contact with different languages and speciating into so many varieties, we have been argued before, without even trying, the comparative method does not apply to Creoles. It doesn't work. Nobody has ever tried. And there is one way of accounting for the emergence of the Romance languages, and it's another way of dealing with the emergence of Creoles. Contact is the reason why one shouldn't apply the comparative method to Creoles, but contact has played such an important role in the emergence of the Romance languages, and nobody has ever said don't apply the comparative method. The term substratum comes from Romanistics. They don't make a lot of use of it in Romanistics anymore, and it has become a central concept in accounts of the development of Creoles. And language contact doesn't seem to be a factor at all when we discuss the dispersal and speciation, call it diversification of Indo-European. And yet, in the same literature, when you read it, you read about pre-Indo-European populations, that is, the populations that lived where the Indo-Europeans went. What happened during the dispersal of the Indo-Europeans? What kinds of relations did they have with the pre-Indo-European populations? Could the speciation of Indo-European have occurred without contact between the pre-Indo-European populations and the Indo-European populations? Okay, and this is already a simplification, because after that, when you follow the history, you also realize that there is a fallacy with this kind of map, because it's like the Indo-Europeans had formed some sort of army, and some general was telling them, this group goes in this direction and this group goes in that other direction. And yet when you read history, things were far from being orchestrated like that, because some Indo-Europeans got to some places before other Indo-Europeans, and that is why later on the Italic populations would colonize the Celtic populations, and that is also why later on the Germanic populations would colonize the Celtic population. So we are dealing with other ways of contact in all these cases. Those linguistic consequences go beyond the speciation of languages into new varieties. Language endangerment and loss are as old as the history of colonization. In the vast majority of cases, the indigenous populations have given up their languages. That's the case of the Celtic populations in southwestern Europe and also in the British Isles. A race-neutral approach to language evolution in North America would show that the experience of Native Americans is not unique, that the African Americans had lost their languages earlier for similar reasons of adaptation to changing socioeconomic ecologies. There are several continental Europeans and the Irish have had a similar experience in North America. That socioeconomic pressures rather than loss of pride in one's heritage are a key factor to language endangerment and loss. And when we discuss the loss of Native American languages, loss of pride in heritage is an explanation that comes back again and again. And that is, I believe, because the whole thing is decontextualized, and because there is this tacit assumption. Everybody is aspiring at white American values or at European traditions and European heritage. And there is very little that is really being looked at from the point of view of the affected populations. An approach to language evolution that centers less on the economic and political hegemony of Europeans would pay more attention to things like the following: the differential progress of language endangerment around the world. European languages are not endangering indigenous languages everywhere. European languages are endangering indigenous languages in the Americas and in Australia, but in Asia and Africa it's a different kind of dynamics, where it's major indigenous languages that are endangering other indigenous languages. And so we need a differential kind of explanation.